There was a man named Elijah, born in the lands of Gilead. History portrays him as one of the greatest prophets of Israel. Even though no books were written exclusively in his honor, his life, however, is intertwined with the tumultuous reigns of Ahab and his son Ahaziah, two notable monarchs in the history of Israel. Elijah emerged as a prominent figure in the 9th century BC, a period filled with prophetic expectations. His influence was so profound that centuries later, representatives of the Jewish people would inquire of John the Baptist about his possible identity. They sought to understand if John could be Elijah, a character whose role was intricately tied to God's plan throughout the ages. The prophesied return of Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord echoed in the Scriptures, as did his striking presence on the Mount of Transfiguration alongside Moses and the Lord himself. In this sacred place, they discuss the redemptive sacrifice that was to come, as written in Malachi 4:5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. However, despite his spiritual importance, little is known about Elijah's origin and family. The Bible only tells us that he was from Gilead, and so we can presume that his story began in Transjordan. Elijah was a man of remarkable physical vigor, as evidenced by his incredible run ahead of King Ahab's chariot from Mount Carmel to the entrance of Jezreel. This feat demonstrated his exceptional physical condition, consistent with his extraordinary career filled with miracles and mighty deeds. On a memorable occasion, Elijah presented himself dramatically and unexpectedly before King Ahab. The message he brought was powerful. There shall be no rain nor dew these years except by my word. Thus the prophet asserted that the fate of the kingdom was entirely linked to the word he spoke. After this bold prediction, Elijah received divine direction to hide by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. There he experienced supernatural provision, with ravens bringing him bread and meat every morning and evening. The brook Cherith, whose exact location remains shrouded in mystery, dried up under divine decree. It was at this critical moment that Elijah received a new instruction from heaven to go to the territory of Zarephath in the heart of Sidon, where a widow would be commissioned to sustain him. Among the many needy, the choice fell upon a widow. Elijah did not ask her to prepare a meal immediately. Instead, he made an apparently unusual request. Make me a small cake first and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son. He explained that under divine providence, the flour and oil she had would not run out until the drought had passed. The story takes us even further. When Elijah arrived at Zarephath, he found this widow with meager supplies of flour and oil on the brink of despair. She understandably doubted the prophet's initial request, fearing it would lead to her son's death. However, Elijah asked her to trust him with faith. He assured her that God would provide abundantly, and this woman's faith allowed the miracle to happen. The flour and oil continued to flow while the drought ravaged the land, and the widow's son was spared. The story does not end there. In a moment of extreme distress, the widow's son became seriously ill to the point of being unable to breathe. In her desperation, the mother accused Elijah, questioning if he had come to remind her of her sins and thus cause her son's death. Elijah, however, took the boy in his arms and carried him to an upper room where he was staying. He prayed intensely to the Lord, pleading for the child's soul to return. And after 3 fervent cries, the Lord heard his plea. The child revived and was returned to his mother's arms, full of life. In an act of recognition of divine intervention, the woman exclaimed to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." This story illustrates the deep faith and direct connection with God that Elijah possessed, demonstrating that God always honors the trust placed in him. But Elijah's journey was far from over. The climax of his story took him to Mount Carmel, a place where the fate of a nation would be sealed. This epic confrontation is recorded in the first book of Kings, chapter 18. After a period of 3 years, the word of the Lord came again to Elijah, instructing him to present himself before Ahab, the king of Israel. God promised to send rain upon the dry land. Elijah, obedient to the divine command, undertook the mission. Meanwhile, a great famine struck Samaria, and Ahab summoned Obadiah, a man who feared God and served in his house. Obadiah deeply feared the Lord, and while Jezebel persecuted and killed the prophets of the Lord, he acted courageously. Obadiah hid 50 prophets in a cave, supplying them with bread and water to protect them from the queen's wrath. As the situation worsened, Ahab and Obadiah decided to explore the land in search of pastures to keep their livestock alive, avoiding the death of the cattle. Ahab went in one direction and Obadiah in another. However, while Obadiah was on his journey, he encountered a surprising figure. Elijah, the feared and sought-after prophet, appeared before him. Recognizing the messenger of God, Obadiah fell to his knees, reverencing him and asking if he was his master Elijah. Elijah, responding calmly, assured Obadiah that he would tell Ahab about their meeting and that he was there. However, Obadiah expressed concern, fearing that by doing so, he himself would be killed. He explained that in his youth he had feared the Lord and taken action to protect God's prophets from Jezebel, hiding them in a cave and providing for them. Now he was apprehensive, fearing the king's wrath. Elijah's narrative unfolds with growing tension, setting the stage for the epic's challenge on Mount Carmel, where faith, courage, and the power of God would be put to the test in a confrontation that would go down in history. With unwavering determination, Elijah confronted King Ahab, who accused him of being a troublemaker in Israel. Elijah, in turn, responded courageously, accusing the king and his household of forsaking the commandments of the Lord in favor of idols. Then Elijah proposed an epic challenge that would change the course of history. He called on Ahab to gather all the people of Israel on Mount Carmel, including the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table, the ruthless queen. The crowd gathered on the mountain, awaiting what was to come. Elijah, in his role as the prophet of the Lord, addressed the people and questioned, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." Elijah's words echoed, but the people remained silent, offering no response. Faced with this hesitation, Elijah outlined the challenge that would demonstrate who the true God was. He proposed that 2 bulls be chosen, one for the prophets of Baal and one for himself, the prophet of the Lord. The bulls would be prepared on wood, but without fire. Then each group would invoke the name of their God, and the God who answered with fire would be recognized as the supreme God. The people agreed to the proposal, and Elijah gave the prophets of Baal the opportunity to go first. They chose the bull, prepared it, and from morning until noon they called on the name of Baal, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no response, no voice, no divine sign. Observing the scene, Elijah could not help but mock. He taunted the prophets of Baal, suggesting that perhaps their God was distracted, on a journey, or even asleep, and needed to be awakened. The desperation of the prophets led them to cut themselves with knives and spears, causing blood to flow in their frenzied ritual, but still, there was no divine response. The day wore on, and despair gripped the prophets of Baal, but the silence persisted. No God answered their call. Elijah, determined to show everyone the power of the true God, gathered the people around him. First, he repaired the broken and neglected altar of the Lord with 12 stones, representing the tribes of Israel. He built a new altar in the name of the Lord. Around the altar, he dug a trench large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. Elijah then placed the wood and the prepared bull on the altar. To intensify the challenge, Elijah ordered 4 jars of water to be poured over the burnt offering and the wood. The people obeyed, and the water ran around the altar, filling the trench. He repeated the process 3 times so that the water completely saturated the altar and the wood, making conventional ignition impossible. The time for the evening sacrifice came, and Elijah, with unwavering confidence, approached the altar. He cried out, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant." He continued with fervent supplication for God to manifest His power, so that the hearts of the people would turn back to Him. In response to this fervent prayer, a miracle occurred. Divine fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and even the water in the trench. It was an indisputable revelation of the divine. Faced with this wonder, the people who had been hesitant before prostrated themselves in reverence and exclaimed, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Certainty and confidence in God were restored in their hearts. Elijah, fulfilling his role as a prophet, ordered the prophets of Baal to be captured, and none of them escaped. Then Elijah instructed King Ahab to prepare for rain was on the way. The sky became black with clouds, the wind increased, and a heavy rain fell, fulfilling God's promise to send the long-awaited rain to the dry land. As the rain began to fall, Elijah, invigorated by the hand of the Lord, girded his loins and, with supernatural determination, ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. It was a moment of triumph and celebration of the faithfulness of the God of Israel, who answered the cry of His servant and demonstrated His power in a magnificent way. After the miracle on Mount Carmel and the coming of the rain, the news reached Jezebel, the wicked and ungodly queen, who became furious with what Elijah had done. She swore vengeance against him and sent a messenger with a death threat. Frightened, Elijah fled to save his life. He left his servant behind and embarked on a long journey into the wilderness. During this journey, he reached a point of exhaustion and despair. Elijah felt overwhelmed by fear and fatigue to the point of wishing for death. He lay down under a broom tree and prayed for God to take his life. While Elijah slept under the tree, an angel of the Lord touched him and brought him food and water. The angel encouraged him to eat and drink, for the journey ahead would be long and challenging. Elijah obeyed and, strengthened by divine sustenance, walked for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. Meanwhile, Jezebel continued her quest for revenge, mistakenly believing that Elijah was dead. At Mount Horeb, Elijah found a cave and spent the night there. God questioned him about the reason for his presence on the mountain. Elijah expressed his zeal for the Lord and his discouragement with the spiritual state of Israel, lamenting how the people had forsaken the Lord's covenant, destroyed His altars, and killed His prophets. He saw himself as the only faithful one to the Lord, and now his life was in danger. God, in His infinite mercy, chose to reveal His presence to Elijah in a special way. First, there was a mighty wind that tore the mountains apart, but the Lord was not in the wind. Next, an earthquake shook the ground, but the Lord was not in the earthquake either. Then a fire came, but God was not in the fire either. Finally, a gentle and quiet voice came, and Elijah knew it was the voice of the Lord. Upon hearing God's voice, Elijah covered his face with his mantle and came out of the cave. God asked him the same question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah repeated his lament and his zeal for the Lord. Then God gave Elijah clear and important instructions. He was to return and anoint Hazael as king of Syria, Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha as a prophet in his place. God also revealed to Elijah that He had reserved 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed down to Baal, showing that he was not alone in his faithfulness to the Lord. Elijah, now renewed and strengthened by communion with God, was ready to fulfill his mission and continue serving the Lord as His prophet. Elijah promptly followed the divine instructions and set out to find Elisha. He found Elisha plowing with 12 pairs of oxen. Elijah threw his mantle over Elisha, symbolizing the divine call. Elisha immediately left the oxen and ran to ask for permission to bid farewell to his parents before following Elijah. Elijah replied that he could do so and then follow him. Elisha demonstrated his commitment by slaughtering the oxen and offering their meat to the people as a final gesture before joining Elijah as his servant. He was willing to leave behind his former life and follow the divine calling with determination. Meanwhile, in Damascus, King Ben-Hadad of Syria was ill. He sent Hazael to meet the prophet Elisha and asked him to inquire of the Lord about his recovery. Hazael brought a generous gift and posed the question to Elisha. The prophet responded that God had shown him that Ben-Hadad would die. However, Elisha stared at Hazael intently and then began to weep. Perplexed, Hazael asked why Elisha was crying. The prophet replied that he was crying because he knew the evil that Hazael would do to the children of Israel. He foresaw that Hazael would set their strongholds on fire, kill their young men with the sword, dash their children, and rip open their pregnant women. Surprised by these words, Hazael questioned how he, a mere servant, could carry out such a terrible act. Elisha then revealed that the Lord had shown him that Hazael would become the king of Syria. Hazael returned to King Ben-Hadad, and the following day assassinated the king, assuming the throne of Syria. Thus, God's prophecies began to come true, with Elisha anointing Hazael as king and Jehu as king of Israel, while Elisha prepared to take on the role of the prophet in place of Elijah. These events marked a significant shift in the history of Israel and Syria. Naboth, a Jew from Jezreel, owned a vineyard near the palace of Ahab, the king of Samaria. Ahab expressed the desire to acquire Naboth's vineyard, offering money or a better vineyard in exchange. However, Naboth refused, citing that the vineyard was an inheritance from his fathers, and he was unwilling to sell it. This left Ahab deeply discontented and sorrowful. His wife Jezebel, noticing her husband's sadness, devised a plan to obtain Naboth's vineyard. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his royal seal, and sent them to the elders and nobles of the city where Naboth lived. In the letters, Jezebel instructed that a fast be proclaimed and that Naboth be given a place of honor. 2 scoundrels were instructed to accuse him of blasphemy against God and the king. Naboth was then stoned to death following the false accusations. When Jezebel informed Ahab that Naboth was dead, he promptly rose to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. However, the Lord sent a message to Elijah, instructing him to confront Ahab in Naboth's vineyard. Elijah approached Ahab and uttered a prophecy, announcing divine condemnation upon the king. God declared that Ahab would be punished for his role in the death of Naboth and for engaging in wicked practices. Ahab's descendants would be exterminated, just as it happened with Jeroboam and Baasha, due to God's provocation and the influence of Jezebel. Furthermore, the Lord proclaimed that dogs would eat Jezebel on the walls of Jezreel, and the birds of the air would devour those who died in the field. When Ahab heard Elijah's words, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, fasted, and mourned. Elijah's message indicated the severe punishment that would fall upon Ahab and his household for the sins they committed against God and the people of Israel. After the events related to Naboth's vineyard, Ahab showed remorse for his involvement in Naboth's death, and the Lord postponed the previously announced punishment by Elijah. However, Ahab's reign continued to be marked by his sins and idolatry in Israel. After Ahab's death, his son Ahaziah ascended to the throne of Israel. King Ahaziah, after suffering a severe injury, sent messengers to consult the god Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, about his chances of recovery. However, Elijah intercepted these messengers and told them that King Ahaziah would die because of his disobedience to God. Elijah then sent the messengers back with the message that King Ahaziah would not recover. King Ahaziah, recognizing Elijah by the description given by the messengers, sent a captain with 50 men to arrest the prophet. When this group of soldiers found Elijah, the captain ordered him to come down at the king's command. Elijah responded by invoking fire from heaven that consumed the captain and his 50 men. The king sent a second group of 50 men with the same order, and once again Elijah called down fire from heaven, consuming the captain and his men. Finally, the king sent a third group, but this captain begged for his life, and Elijah accompanied them safely. The prophet Elijah predicted that King Ahaziah would not recover from his injury, and this came to pass. Ahaziah died according to Elijah's word, and Joram succeeded him as king of Israel. When the time came for Elijah to be taken up to heaven, he and Elisha were busy traveling between the prophetic schools in Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho. Elijah asked Elisha to stay in Gilgal, then in Bethel, but Elisha swore that he would not leave him. The sons of the prophets and Elijah were aware that the Lord would take Elijah away. After leaving Jericho, as they left Jericho, both prophets miraculously crossed the Jordan River. Elijah struck the waters with his mantle, and they parted to provide passage. He then asked Elisha what he would like as a final favor. Elisha requested a double portion of his master's spirit, and Elijah agreed to grant it if Elisha saw him when he departed. Suddenly, a chariot and horses of fire separated them, and a whirlwind took Elijah away while Elisha watched and cried out, saying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." Elisha took up the mantle of his master that had fallen, crossed the Jordan, and went to Jericho, where the sons of the prophets recognized that Elijah's spirit rested upon Elisha, as recorded in 2 Kings, chapter 2. 1:15. So, when the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho saw him, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." And they came to meet him, and bowed to the ground before him. The sons of the prophets in Jericho came to meet Elisha, bowed before him, and persisted in seeking Elijah. Reluctantly, Elisha agreed to send 50 men in search of Elijah, but they returned without success. When Jehu became king, he used Elijah's prophecy about the destruction of Ahab's house to justify the annihilation of all of Ahab's relatives. As recorded in 1 Kings 21:21, "Behold, I will bring evil upon thee, and will take away thy posterity, and will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall." Jehu killed all the remaining members of Ahab's house in Jezreel, including its leaders, priests, and close acquaintances. Then he departed and went to Samaria, where he found the brothers of Ahaziah, king of Judah, who were captured and killed. Subsequently, Jehu encountered Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, and invited him to join him. They shared their zeal for the Lord, and Jehu took him in his chariot. Upon reaching Samaria, Jehu continued to carry out the will of the Lord, eliminating all remnants of Ahab, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. When Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, erected idolatrous altars and led Judah away from God, Elijah sent him a prophetic letter warning him of the impending disaster that would befall the nation due to his apostasy, as recorded in 2 Chronicles 21:12. Elijah's letter said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, because you have not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, or in the ways of Asa king of Judah." Elijah's life was marked by the conflict between the worship of the Lord and the religion of Baal. During his time, many in Israel worshipped Baal, with Melkart being the most prominent deity of Tyre. Ahab, the king of Israel, married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of Tyre and Sidon, and she persecuted the prophets of the Lord, promoting the worship of Baal in Israel. The drought that occurred during Elijah's ministry demonstrated Baal's impotence as a supposed nature deity, while Elijah, through divine providence, showcased God's ability to care for his people even amidst this crisis. The showdown on Mount Carmel led to a national decision in Israel, and Elijah's subsequent flight took him to the site of an earlier revelation on Mount Horeb. The encounter between Ahaziah and Elijah demonstrated that there was a God in Israel, superior to Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. Throughout his life, Elijah was a man of God, a prophet, and a spokesman for the true God, witnessing the power of the one true God. Later in Scripture, Elijah is mentioned in Malachi 4:5, where it is prophesied that he will return before the day of the Lord, a prophecy that has fulfillment in both the New Testament and the future. The angel of the Lord also announced to Zechariah that John the Baptist, his son, would go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, with the mission of turning hearts and reconciling fathers and children, preparing a people ready for the Lord, as stated in Luke 1:17. And he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. Despite John's denial that he was Elijah, Jesus referred to him as Elijah, who was to come in John 1:19-25. When asked if he was Elijah, John responded that he was not Elijah nor the prophet, but the voice of one crying in the wilderness, "Make straight the way of the Lord," quoting the words of the prophet Isaiah. Those who questioned him were Pharisees and asked why he was baptizing, if he was not the Christ, Elijah, or the prophet. In Matthew 11:14, Jesus similarly referred to John the Baptist as Elijah, saying that if they were willing to receive it, he was Elijah who was to come. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. And the disciples asked him, "Why then do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?" He replied, "Elijah does indeed come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him." Additionally, Jesus was also considered by some Jews to be Elijah, as mentioned in Matthew 16:14 and Mark 6:15, where people speculated about his identity, with some saying he was John the Baptist, others Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Others said, "It is Elijah." And others said, "It is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old." During his ministry, Jesus referred to the reception of Elijah by the widow of Zarephath and the lack of faith in Israel as examples. Luke 4:24-26. Elijah also appeared on the scene of the Transfiguration, where he and Moses conversed with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Mark 9:5. There was also a moment when Jesus, while on the cross, cried out to God with the words, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which are interpreted as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46-49, and Mark 15:34-35. Some of the onlookers mistook these words for a reference to Elijah, suggesting that Elijah might come to save him. Paul, in defending the principle of a remnant in Israel, referred to the 7,000 faithful worshippers from the time of Elijah. These individuals demonstrated unwavering devotion to the Lord, becoming fearless advocates of what is right. They did not shrink back in the face of the hostile king's vehement condemnation, nor did they cower in the face of the fanatical opposition of the priests of Baal. Elijah's human side is also revealed in his fleeing from the vengeful Jezebel, who sent him a threatening message of death. This combination of zealous bravery and human fallibility highlights the power of prayer as demonstrated by this man of God. Elijah was of the same nature as us, yet he prayed fervently, and God answered his prayers, as recorded in James 5:17-18. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. In addition to being an enthusiastic religious leader, Elijah was also a devoted patriot, and his zealous service to God was tempered by a genuine concern for the nation of Israel. He was an example of faith and courage, as well as a man who understood the power of prayer. In his journey of serving God and his people, may the story of Elijah inspire us to persevere, to pray fervently, and never to back down in the face of adversity. May we be like the 7,000 faithful and be a remnant that seeks to live according to God's will in our lives. Always remember, just like Elijah, with faith and prayer, we can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and witness the power of God in our lives. May the story of Elijah be a source of encouragement for all of us as we continue our journey of faith and service to God. Thank you for watching, and may God bless all of you.